One of the gifts of the Judeo-Christian tradition are a collection of writings that come to us from ancient communities of Israel. In those writings, we have 4 different portraits of Jesus of Nazareth that are given to us by a community of writers writing between some 60 and 70 years after the death of Jesus of Nazareth. The earliest of those collection of writings that give us a portrait of Jesus is the Gospel of Mark. And each of those 4 writers that give us a sense of Jesus of Nazareth, each introduce their story in one way or another with this story of Jesus' baptism. This is the earliest story we have from Mark chapter 1. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in the north of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan River. And just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens open and sensed a spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice was heard, "You are my child. You are beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately took Jesus from the river out into the wilderness. This is a story from the Jesus tradition passed down to us in first century writings. Don and I have been making lots of tracks in the snow since we saw you last. Some of them with our feet and some of them with our skis. After a fresh snowfall where we live at South Cooking Lake, I find myself hoping that someone else will have been out ahead of me to do the work of setting a track. That they will have found the best way across the lake or the best way across the field. But I've noticed it's both helpful to have a track to follow, and it's also really hard to follow someone else's tracks. I think there have been track setters in each of our lives. Teachers, mentors, those who've blazed the way for us. And those we have chosen to follow for one way or reason or another, whether it's in our careers or whether it's in our parenting or whether it's in how we live our lives. And it strikes me that John, a cousin of Jesus, may have been that for him. Following the path of ancient Israel's prophets, John found a way to call himself and his contemporaries back to the best in themselves, to a spirituality of living with a more just and a more fair imprint, to a reformation of the worst of what their temple religion had become, to a justice and an equity that it had been meant to safeguard in their society. Jesus' path took him into the harsh terrain of the desert, as John's path had taken him there, where John began to set a new track that involved a change of heart, a change of direction, a change in values, and a change in lifestyle. And he invited others to participate in that with him and to initiate that intention with a kind of ritual bath, to wash away the religiosity and the pretense, the complicity with exploitation of the temple practices, to wash away their affiliation with the power structures and the values that had come to dominate their lives and their society, and to make a kind of clean and fresh start on a new ethical path of living more fairly, more justly. The first century storytellers suggest that the path that Jesus began laying down, the path that he invited others to share, the path that had begun in that desert movement of John the Baptizer, we aren't told what compelled him to make his way from Nazareth to the wilderness where John was calling people to make a new way of life. We aren't told how long he was part of that community around John and John's teaching. All we know is that for some reason or another, he responded to John's call to a new way of being, and he emerged from the waters of his baptism to give himself to the needs around him, to immerse himself in the sacredness of life. He emerged to an itinerant but an intentional life to live with passion, to seek the company of those who lived on the margins of his society, to learn the lessons of the natural world, and to be immersed in the very mystery of what it is to be. And undoubtedly, he made some mistakes. Likely, he had some regrets. But he lived deeply and intentionally and ethically and passionately. And he came up out of those waters with a commitment to take his place in the world. Whether his family understood him or not, whether he was accepted or rejected by his peers, whether he was perceived to be a hero or a heretic or a troublemaker, that didn't matter. What he found in those primal waters was an affirmation of belonging, and an invitation to be immersed in life. In the world of the ancient story, baptism had absolutely nothing to do with belief and everything to do with intention. Jesus made no profession of faith in the Jordan River, but he emerged from that river to live a life that has much to teach us about respect, mutuality, integrity, compassion, loving others, even the enemy. He was a track setter, but he wasn't a lone wolf. In his teachings, many of us have discerned an honorable and loving path for life. Both among his contemporaries and for the generations since, many have discerned a faithful path for living the values taught and lived by this first century wisdom teacher. But like any path that life invites us to follow, we each have to make our own imprint. We bring our own wisdom and wonder, our own gait and stride to the path. So the path is not about walking in the footsteps of Jesus. It's about walking with the values and intentions, living a larger life, focused on the common good, not just what's good for me. Or as the Buddha taught, it's not just walking the path. It's becoming the path. Each day in this new year is an invitation for us to take one more step along that road. One more step of being immersed in the sacred, of sinking into life instead of skimming the surface, trying never to get wet. Each day is an invitation to be immersed in wonder and reverence and awe, in compassion, not submerged in the regrets of the past, but immersed in the possibilities of the present. And each day we live holds the capacity to baptize us with the affirmation of our belovedness and of our belonging. We celebrate baptism with Dylan this day as a new year and a new opportunity for each of us to make fresh tracks on an ancient path, to sink into the sacredness of life, and to get more than our feet or our foreheads wet.
Under the category of don't judge a book by its cover comes don't judge where you might find wisdom based on the perceived age group of the book you're going to read. This is a book entitled Beautiful Oops by Barney Salzberg, intended for all of us. This is a bit challenging to read and to present on the screen, but we'll manage to read it together. Oops. A torn piece of paper is really just the beginning. Every spill has lots. Next slide. Of possibilities. Bent paper is something to celebrate. A little drip of paint lets your imagination run wild. A scrap of paper can be fun to play with. A smudge and a smear can make magic appear. And a stain has potential if you play with its shape. Holes in your paper are worth exploring. When you think you've made a mistake, oops, think of it as an opportunity to make something beautiful. This is the wisdom of a contemporary children's author. May we find wisdom for our living. There really is a certain joy in getting things wrong. Not all the time, of course. That's debilitating. But as children, we're actually quite good at getting things wrong. We explore our interests. We try this, we try that. We reach new heights. We fail. We stumble. And as we're bound to do, we pick ourselves up and we carry on and we try something else. As we grow older, though, we don't do this quite as well. From teenage years on, we begin worrying about other people, what they might think of us, whether what we do is within the parameters of acceptable, whether that's social convention, whether it's cool, whether it's expected. And we operate in the mindset that if I look and act put together, I might avoid being criticized or shamed or blamed or laughed at. Bruce Mao writes this. He says, being cool is a defensive position. Being cool is staying in a stable place of doing nothing that will make us seem foolish. We figure out what cool is once, and then we stay there. In fact, cool is an infection that overcomes the beauty of living. Because to be foolish, to be creative, especially with things that don't at first turn out, to make false starts and errors, to find our own way in our work and life, you just can't be cool doing that. It's going to be messy. and life and figuring out our lives and our paths is messy. I had an improvisation teacher once, music improv, that told me some of the best advice I've ever heard. He says, when you're improvising, don't make small mistakes, make gigantic ones. Because only if they're big and put you at risk of the whole audience knowing it's a complete blunder, only then will you find your way out of them and into a revelation. In the act of living, although we make our own tracks, we often find ourselves making tracks in lots of different directions, some that turn out well, and some not so much. Brené Brown talks about the spiritual connection between our wrong turns, our mistakes, and our connection with each other. In her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, Brené Brown speaks about our imperfections being precisely the thing that connects us to humanity and gives us a birthing place for our spirituality. Those connections are with people. They're why we're here. We're hardwired for connection in life. We call that connection many things. We call it love, we call it friendship, we call it spirituality, we call it sacredness. Connection is what we do. And when connection is absent in our life, well, we fill those holes with other things. My non-connectedness is often filled with potato chips, but all of you would have your own things that you fill your non-connectedness with. And there's lots of other harmful things that can take connection's place. But we're hardwired for connection and belonging. And very often our imperfections and mistakes are what draws us into connection. If we were perfect, we'd have no need of anyone. When we're grieving a lost connection, when we really need help because we realize we can't do something on our own, when we get ourselves into sticky situations of all kinds, connection happens. Because we find ourselves in need of it. The great loves we have in our life are aware of our mistakes, our imperfections, and love us despite of it, and because of them. That's why we call them loves in our life, because they love us for who we really are. The rotten thing about our desire to look and act as though we've got it all together is that it stands in the way of our connection a lot of times. And even more than that, we start believing, falsely, we start believing that revealing our imperfections and our off-course tracks, going this way and that, is what's preventing us from connection in our life. And it's absolutely backwards when we start believing that. When we start getting that wrong, especially we perfectionists, we find ourselves in crisis. Because we think if we let the real us out, we'll be alone. But just the opposite is true. We're all worthy of love and belonging. That's the spiritual truth we affirm whenever we're together, right? And that's just not an easy platitude we say. It's challenging, it's difficult, it's strenuous to live that out. Because many of us do struggle with wanting to look all put together. And when we strive for that, when we strive to be perfect in our own eyes, in others' eyes, when we strive to be just what someone else wants us to be, we have this conflicting narrative. We say that we're worthy of love and belonging, but secretly we think that our imperfections make us unworthy of that love and belonging. So where do we go? The truth is we cling onto the persona we want others to have of us so tightly that we might just have white knuckles from the holding on. Our desire to be liked, accepted, based not on our imperfect connections, but on our apparent competency is so strong that we do have trouble just letting go of it. It reminds me of a story I heard about a woman in New York. A train pulls up to the subway platform at Grand Central Station, and a well-dressed woman gets off the train. But as she does, she realizes that she only has one glove. And the other one is on the train, and she sees it right through the window. It's on the seat where she was sitting. The doors of the train are closing. There's no hope of her getting back on the train. And in the quickest of flashes, she realized she won't get her glove. So she shrugs her shoulders and throws the remaining glove through the door. The train pulls out of the station, and the woman shuffles on up the escalator. That's a great story, whether it happened or not. It's a great story. After spending so much energy trying to keep things together, trying to live to a certain standard, trying not to lose things like gloves and relationships and perceptions and beliefs, there come certain times when you just have to stretch your arm out and toss what's left onto the moving train, knowing that what little you grasp onto isn't really worth anything to you anymore. We either clutch on to the last vestige of expectations, of false pretenses, of half-truths of who we are, or we release our grip on it. We take a risk and be utterly ourselves. We live in the moment, and we say, "This is who I am. This is all I've got." And sometimes, in order to do that, we have to toss a glove onto a train, or we just have to feel the excitement of being who we are, to remind ourselves to loosen up, to live a little, to undo our tie, because we've only got one pass through this life. And we are who we are. That's why the message of this book, of Beautiful Oops, is so powerful, regardless of how old we are. In the adventure of discovery, waiting for things to be perfect before we even begin, could you imagine? If we wait for the perfect circumstances, and yet we do it. If we wait for the perfect time, or the perfect opportunity, the perfect moment to tell someone what we really need to tell them, that perfect moment will never come. It's a sure way to stall our journey before it even gets started. And the danger of forgetting that we're on this adventurous journey is that we risk falsely believing we can stay perfect, that our art can be perfect the first time, that we can make perfect tracks and create art without a misplaced stroke. But we know that life actually happens when we're brave enough to just start, to make the tracks we need to make, the brush strokes we need to brush, and to know that there's connection. There's connection, because life is connection. There's community, there's communion with those who care about us and will help us along. Which brings us to this table right here. The beautiful thing about this ritual that we will share around this table is that when it was marked by Jesus and his friends, as the story goes, it was in the midst of what they perceived to be a total failure of their movement. A movement of love, of justice, of compassion, ended all in one room with the threat of persecution, pending trials, judgments, and execution. And what they would learn, though, when they came together as a bunch of friends, what we ourselves learn, should we give ourselves permission, is that these events aren't failures. They're a series of beautiful oopses, waiting to be created with the help of community into something beautiful. When this ritual was in one room with a few followers of a man that led a movement, it became something else. Not an honoring of their failure, but of being together and creating something hopeful. Creating a connection between friends that would outlast any trial, conviction, or death. This act of communion, of being together in community, isn't something that confines our path. It's not something that says, here, do it this way. This is a celebration of the fact that we have a place that allows us to make as many tracks in the snow as we need. That we have a place where we can always know we can return. It's the people we know who will always be at our side and behind us and in front of us, with support and encouragement of community. This is the place, and these are the people who let us be who we are, who let us venture the paths we need to try and come back with support, with care, with nourishment to offer for our next outing. That's the beauty of community, and that's the beauty of this time together. Communion and connection for who we are, for ourselves, and for each other. And that's worth celebrating. And that's why we do this. To celebrate our connection with each other founded on our honest selves, mistakes and imperfections galore. If it takes throwing a glove on a train, or if it takes making a fool of ourselves, if it takes lightening up with ourselves to give ourselves the space to just be, then that's who we're going to be together. And we'll make those tracks side by side. That's this ritual. That's what we're invited to. We'll make these tracks side by side. We come to this table joined together by our quest for community, for belonging, for the communion of spirit that comes with being fellow journeyers making tracks in this life.
And at this table, we remember the stories that gave us this ritual, the stories of those who taught that love and community can topple regimes of control and hate and fear. We remember the friends that gathered around Jesus and transformed an ancient ritual of breaking bread and sharing a cup into an act of hope, of possibility, of something new.
And so we come to this table, grateful for the ones in our lives who give us strength and support on our journey. Grateful with words we'll share together as we strengthen our intentions to live. We open to the sacredness at the heart of all, called by many names. We open to deep mystery we trust to be love. May we be faithful to the vision of building heaven on earth, that there may be daily bread to nourish all hunger, that we experience forgiveness for the harm we have done, just as we forgive those who hurt us. May we not feel abandoned in hard times, but find the strength to meet each moment and the wisdom to walk in the light of deep gratitude. For the light of love is with us now and forever. Amen.
There isn't anyone who isn't welcome at this table. No one is excluded. To participate in this simple meal of this community, you don't need to be a member of this or any church. If we hunger for connection, we're welcome. If we thirst to celebrate spirit and justice and hope and compassion, we are welcome. So come.
This is bread for our journey and the cup of community, and we're all welcome.